You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet, in London. Under a new scheme in the UK, 1,000 visas are being reserved each year for what's being dubbed the next generation of Nobel Prize winners. This comes as one of the UK's universities has just had their foreign student visa revoked, meaning 2,700 non-EU students face being deported if they cannot find alternative university places in the next 60 days. Joining today's discussion is Senior Partner and the Head of the Immigration and Employment Law Department at Magrath LLP, Chris Magrath, and Senior Researcher, Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford Centre of Migration Policy and Society, Carlos Vargas-Silva. And joining us on the phone is immigration lawyer Anne Morris, who is a principal at DavidsonMorris Solicitors and began her career at the Home Office. So the question today is, should visas be reserved just for the exceptionally talented scientists, artists and musicians who want to make a life in Britain? And will the UK therefore become the chosen destination for future Nobel Peace Prize winners, as said by the Immigration Minister, Damian Green? I'll come to you first, please. Chris Magrath.
I doubt it very much. I mean, first of all, the scheme is it's limited to 1,000 places. It's slightly difficult to know how they're going to attract these people in the first place. They've got to be sponsored with a small s, put forward by any one of four institutions, the Arts Council, the British Academy, the Royal Society for Engineering and so on. And these people are going to be attracted, presumably, to the UK to do that which they are doing perfectly well where they are currently living. It's hard to see why anybody at the top level would want to come here if they've already made their name and reputation elsewhere. It is possible that we can be looking at, quote-unquote, the next generation of Nobel Prize winners, but then we've got to get them young. Why would we want to get them young? Well, we can't actually pick them up from the universities here because you cannot move into this category from student status. So you've got to come from abroad. Therefore, the Arts Council, for example, or the British Academy have got to find these people from Delhi University or the University of Canberra or Harvard or whatever and say, this 25-year-old is going to be a superstar in the next 10 years. Realistically, it's not going to happen. But there's another dimension to this, if I'm not overrunning my time, which is, and I posed this question initially anyway, at the present time, why would people who have already created a name for themselves, who have already created a career and a reputation, want to come to the United Kingdom when the entire immigration process at the moment is centred upon one basic mantra: we do not want you to come here. And Juliet, you mentioned in your introduction the withdrawal of the sponsor licence from London Metropolitan University, which puts 2,000 foreign, i.e. non-EU students' places at risk. If they cannot find alternative universities or colleges to go to within 60 days, they will be invited to leave the UK. That's the nice way of putting it. It's called administrative removal. That will be a disaster for this country. It'll be a disaster financially, it'll be a disaster in terms of how this country is perceived, and it will give a huge boost to our competitors in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who are competing for the same students. And one final point to make on this, the student industry in this country, as far as foreign visas are concerned, the amount of money varies depending on what publication you read. But at the low end, it's anywhere between £3 and £4 billion of export money per year, up to potentially £11 billion. They are talking about trying to increase that to £16 billion a year, a huge amount, when everybody tells us this country has no money. That being the case, to send out this message and to rather negligently potentially lose 2,000 of our students while sending out the message to the world that I think the wonderful quote from Mr. Green that I read yesterday was, "I'm not chucking these people out, I'm just enforcing the rules."
Yeah.
I think we've heard that one before.
No, I completely agree with you, Chris. I think the mixed messages that are being sent out are a disaster. This is a public relations disaster in the making, and it has been over the last couple of years. This isn't just an isolated incident with the university. I don't know the full reasons why they've systematically failed their audit. You know, we have to be realistic. The rules are there, but I think the Home Office, when also they give very little assistance to the sponsors to always be able to fully comply. The guidelines that we receive as practitioners, as you know best, as transparent as mud sometimes. You speak to the policy guidance people, they don't understand how to interpret the rules. So we don't really know what's happened at the university, but I think that the Home Office should have stepped in and worked hand in hand with them to ensure that those students didn't go into free fall panic. The amount of money that they have individually paid is a disgrace for this now to happen. And I think, you know, back to the trying to attract, you know, the next greatest Einstein to the UK, we're not attracting anybody of any value or worth right now because skilled people are taking their skills elsewhere. So it's a disaster in the making right now.
Carlos, you're from the Centre of Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Are we attracting the next generation of Nobel Prize winners? Is this selected visa policy a good policy?
I think that in order to understand this new program, you have to put it into the context of what is happening with migration in the UK. So the Conservative government has decided to cut net migration from the current level, and we got new numbers yesterday. It was 216,000 to 100,000 or less. So they want to cut net migration. Before, there were two ways of coming for work purposes from non-EU countries to the UK. One was the Tier 1, which was for high-skilled migrants, and the other one was the Tier 2 route, which basically was for sponsored workers. Basically, you were a skilled migrant, and you had a job offer. Now, the government decided to cut Tier 1, basically because, according to the government, there were many people who were technically high-skilled, but were doing low-skilled jobs in the UK. So, and then when they cut Tier 1, they replaced that with these 1,000 visas. Now, the reason to include these 1,000 visas was not to attract talent to the UK. It was basically to allow talent to come to the UK. So if they want to come to the UK for some other reason, then these 1,000 visas will allow them to come here. And will allow them to come here without a job offer. As Chris was saying, they need also to be sponsored by one of four institutions. So basically there's an outside body that is basically saying that this person is really high skill and has the sufficient skill to go into the program. So basically the program is not to attract but to allow. In that sense, I don't see how the program is going to encourage people, these Nobel Prizes or future Nobel Prizes, to come to the UK.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, in London. Today's discussion is on immigration, and joining me is senior researcher at the University of Oxford Centre on Migration Policy and Society, Carlos Vargas-Silva. On the telephone, immigration lawyer Anne Morris, who's a principal at Davidsonmorris Solicitors, and Chris Magrath, the head of immigration and employment law at Magrath LLP.
It's interesting what Carlos said. I mean, and again, he's absolutely right, and Anne made the same point. This is in a context where the current government is caught on the hook of its own populist promise. It went into the last election promising unachievable figures, which is that we are going to bring, quote-unquote, net migration down to the levels that we saw in, I'm assuming, the early to middle 90s. Well, of course, it overlooks huge amounts of facts. It overlooks that in the last 15 to 17 years, the global marketplace has shrunk quite dramatically, that our financial dependence upon other countries is much greater now than it ever was. And I'm excluding the EU from this, with whom, of course, we're joined at the hip and will be in the foreseeable future. Secondly, it ignores the fact that China, India, Brazil, the BRICS countries, and many others are beginning to outstrip us economically. If they want to do trade with us, or if they're willing to do trade with us, they've got to see that we're willing to play ball with them. And they do not perceive that as being the case. And thirdly, in terms of the figures, I mean, you cannot do a Canute here. You cannot roll the tide of evolution back. they're trying to bring numbers down to unachievable levels to satisfy the editor of The Sun. That is no way to run a government policy. And finally, on that point, they are including student numbers in the numbers that they wish to bring down to the levels of the 1990s, i.e., as Carlos said, to less than 100,000. This is, again, I use Anne's word because I wouldn't disagree with it, it is nonsensical. Because although students may well stay afterwards, the vast majority of them do go away. They are not here in a category which leads to permanent residence, so they have to have a job offer, they have to be needed by an employer going forward. It does seem absurd to throw students in. And the final point on that is we need these students. I'm repeating myself because it is absolutely vital that we are seen to be encouraging foreign students to come in. Going to university now is extremely expensive. But now, so many people cannot afford to go to university from within the indigenous population in the UK. Universities, to keep going, are desperate for the foreign students. And we're sending out these messages to the foreign students. We want your money. We want you to come. We don't want too many of you to come. And in any event, if we fall out with your educational institution, you are at risk of having to leave.
And Morris.
You know, on from what Chris is saying, the students have been hit by a double whammy. You know, not only have they had their overseas fees increase, there's an exceptional amount of money to go to uni here, but also in order to attract the students, many years ago, they introduced this Fresh Talent for Scotland scheme, which was brilliant. It meant that the universities in Scotland could offer the places to the foreign students, then they would get a 2-year visa afterwards, permitting them to work. And you know yourself, as a graduate, you need to get your foot on the ladder as soon as you can, and having that visa was fantastic. It was not abused. Then they had the post-study worker route, and again that was rolled out right across all the universities in the UK. If you graduated, you could work for 2 years, again get your foot on the ladder, and the students are complied with it. You know, students are not here to break the law. They work exceptionally hard, and they are, as Chris has already identified, a financial, you know, we cannot financially do without them. So the students have been hit, not only now with having this dreadful mixed message from the Home Office about, you know, we don't want you, they've also taken away those really useful routes. And so it's very difficult now for them to compete in the marketplace, because you come here, you spend all this money here, and then at the end of your 3 or 4 years or 5 years if you're doing a PhD, thank you and good night, go home. Whereas actually, as Chris has identified, we haven't got enough students going to uni here anyway. The universities need these people, and then we need a skilled workforce. I very much feel we're cutting our noses off to spite our face on this.
I'd like to pick up, in fact, on something that Carlos mentioned earlier, because he suggested that the new exceptional talent scheme, limited to 1,000, rolled off the back of the disappearance of the Tier 1 general process, where you could come in as on a freestanding work permit, effectively, and do what you wanted. And the excuse given to reduce that was, as Carlos says, that there were a lot of Tier 1 general people doing very low-skilled jobs. I would just like to take slight issue with that. There was a very distorted and very selective survey which was undertaken by or on behalf of the UK Border Agency, which suggested that to be the case. But it was very heavily criticised, and we have represented hundreds, maybe possibly thousands, it's difficult to know over the years, of Tier 1 general people. I never once, and my firm never once, and I'm sure Anne's firm never once, would ever have secured a Tier 1 general visa for somebody to do shelf stacking in a supermarket.
Absolutely not. Well, you know yourself how high the threshold was for the earnings and for the skill set and the qualifications. These people are highly skilled migrants. In fact, that's what the scheme was originally called, wasn't it? The highly skilled migrant scheme. And it's a disgrace that that the Home Office, as you say, they had a very distorted view on it and said, well, you know, in a couple of cases, people are doing 2 jobs or 3 jobs to hit the earning threshold. Yes. Well, you know what? I think if someone's prepared to take on 3 jobs, that's the kind of person I want in this country. Very hard-working, very conscientious. That's exactly what we're looking for.
Carlos.
So I agree with this. I mean, the Home Office story was very targeted. It is very difficult to say that the majority of Tier 1 migrants were not doing high-skilled jobs. Now, to put it into context about this exceptional talent route, there are 1,000 spaces available, and there are these 4 institutions that can give those 1,000 places that can sponsor. In the year to June 2012, which is the data that was released yesterday, in that entire year, only 32 people apply under this program. So basically it means that nobody is using this program. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that they can apply under other routes. I mean, they can apply as Tier 2 migrants if they have a job offer. So this program is really for exceptional talent people that do not want to be attached to a specific institution or a specific job. So most of these people, because they are very talented, they have a job offer when they move to the UK. So in some sense, they don't need the program.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, in London. Joining today's discussion is Senior Partner and Head of the Immigration and Employment Law at Magrath LLP, Chris Magrath, and Senior Researcher at University of Oxford Centre on Migration Policy and Society, Carlos Vargas-Silva. And joining us on the phone is immigration lawyer Anne Morris, Principal at DavidsonMorris Solicitors.
Over 10 years ago, in the early part of the last decade, the UK Border Agency, it was then the Immigration and Nationality Department, introduced a programme which is very similar, and it was called the Innovator Programme.
That's right, yeah.
I do not believe that in all the years that I've been doing immigration and since the Innovator Programme existed, my firm, and certainly I know I personally, never did one Innovator application. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that the total number of people who applied to stay in the UK or come to the UK as an innovator, in quotes, probably less than 10. And they eventually abolished it because it was just hopeless.
The whole idea that you're sponsored to come to the UK, that you get this, this one of these amazing 1,000 visas, how are you going to financially survive? You have to be very realistic here. This is a very expensive country to live in, and so you might well be highly talented and wonderful, exceptional, but at the end of the day, you've got to be able to survive financially. And I think what the government should be doing is introducing schemes that are absolutely workable. The post-study scheme, the Tier 1 scheme was brilliant. It attracted the talent. So why we're having to wrap it up now, as you say, back to the old-time innovator scheme, I don't know.
I think another way, sorry Juliet for interrupting, is you've got to be able to speak English.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're an absolutely fantastic singer, dancer, you do things to make the Notting Hill Carnival work wonderfully or the Olympic opening festival work beautifully and so on. Although, to be fair, I think that was homegrown. But if you fall into sort of any of these categories, then the basis on which you're going to be able to come here does not require you to speak English. You can split an atom without knowing how to speak English, and yet speaking English is one of the major requirements, one of the major attributes that you have to meet. That'll put off an awful lot of people from China who can be very sharp and very bright, not speak a word of English, and indeed the research and the scientific stuff they're doing, or the entertainment stuff that they're doing, does not require them to speak English either.
But what seems to me is these numerous amounts of mixed messages coming from the UK government on, are we open for business for foreign students? Are we not? Oh, yes, we are, but are we not? Oh, if you're really skilled, but then you're probably going to go elsewhere anyway because you don't need us. But we still want the Nobel Peace Prize winners. But on the same hand, we've just got 2,700 students who face being invited to leave the country because they cannot find alternative institutions to take them on after the institution that they've made an agreement with and they've been given a place by have failed in their duties according to the Home Office. What future policy should be in place if to stop these mixed messages or to actually increase the talent coming to the UK?
Well, in the case of the students, you have to put it into context too. They want to hit this 100,000 target of net migration, but the number of non-EU students in the UK keeps increasing. So about 60% of non-EU migration are students. So basically this number has kept increasing. And it is very difficult to justify putting a cap on students because as Chris was saying, students are a big contribution to the UK economy. So basically if you cannot put a cap and limit the number of non-EU students, basically you have to be more strict. And in their terms trying to separate between bogus students and legitimate students. Now the problem is that sometimes it is the institution what they're attacking, not really the bogus students. So you have an institution that probably didn't have all checks in line with what they were supposed to be, and then all students in that institution, many of which, the majority of which are legitimate, get affected. But before going to other topics, I want to also point out that we have been talking about Nobel Prize winners and potential Nobel Prize winners. If you go a step down to the tier 2, which are skilled workers, so these are not high-skilled workers, just skilled workers, there's a cap on the number of skilled workers of about 21,000. But in the numbers that were released yesterday, only 9,000 people had come under that route. So basically, it's not that we're not attracting the very high skill, we are not attracting the high skilled workers under this cap.
And the reason for that, amongst others, is because of the message that the government has sent out, which is, we do not want you to come. That it's a very tortuous route to come to the UK to work in Tier 2, in other words, the old work permit successor scheme. If you are a new hire, no matter how sharp you are, no matter how bright, no matter how many qualifications you have, if you're coming here under Tier 2, you're not allowed, as a sponsor, to assign the work permit, which is easier, it rolls off the tongue easier than certificate of sponsorship, which is the correct term, without first getting permission from the UK border agencies. You could fill all these forms. Not easy, certainly not for a technophobe like myself. You make these applications, you submit them, you then wait, you get the response, you then assign the certificate of sponsorship. People and employers do not want to do this. They've got enough regulatory processes they have to comply with, which affect primarily small businesses because they don't have the headcount internally in their administrative areas to be able to deal with this. So lots of them say, we're not even going to be a sponsor. We're not going to do this because it's causing us too many difficulties. And as far as the student situation is concerned, I agree with Anne entirely. It would not be right to make any adverse comment as to the manner in which London Metropolitan University has or has not complied with its obligations under the sponsor licence regime. We just don't know that. But let us just assume, for the sake of this debate, that London Metropolitan University is in breach of the obligations imposed upon it. It should have done better. Well, it strikes me when the consequences of revoking the licence, which is a last straw measure, when the consequences of that were going to cause such adverse effects, not just immediately and in the short term, but in the long term and in terms of the perception of this country to potential students abroad, there must have been a better way of dealing with this.
Absolutely.
I agree, and it goes back to what you said, Anne, at the beginning about this being an absolute PR disaster. On one hand, you've got the Immigration Minister, Damien Green, saying, we want the future Nobel winners and, you know, we've got 1,000 talent visas available for all of you who want to come here. And on the same side, they're taking away the opportunity from universities in the capital city of the United Kingdom to actually offer students a place. And worse still is the students who are currently here, who have made that agreement with that university and have faced an uncertain future. And also the advice, you know, with the economy as it is that the UK ought to remain competitive within the higher education system and compete with Australia, Canada, who, you know, could cream off the applications that the UK, the very Immigration Minister, would like to see here.
Yes, they will cream it off. I was speaking to a senior diplomat the other day from a country with whom we compete directly for places. And he said it would be completely inappropriate for me to criticise any policy of a government, particularly a government where I am here as a guest. But let me say that I am extremely happy indeed with the student immigration policies being applied by the UK government. Well, he would be because, of course, there's a big percentage fall-off of people who could be coming here and they will be going to his country.
But it's not the financial attribution of students, foreign students coming to the UK. Obviously, it's the cultural, it's the campuses, and it's the reflection of society in general. Now, Carlos, we're almost at the end of this discussion, but I would like to hear from you again on what sort of future policies could be implemented that would almost seem to sort of get the UK out of what has happened with mixed messages that are going to trickle through the globe and discourage foreign students from choosing the UK as a top destination to come and study here.
I mean, I think one of the things you have to do is not to be changing the rules of the game all the time. So in that sense, it's very difficult for people to come here. Like, for instance, people that came in 2001 and then Tier 2 are not allowed to settle now in the UK. So basically, if you keep changing the rules of the game all of the time, that's what confuses people and basically doesn't attract people. If the rules of the game are clear, and they're not start changing those rules all the time, I think people just play the game and they realize what they need to settle here, what you need to store here, and then I think it's more about not changing rules all the time than to have specific rules.
Final word from you, please, Chris.
Well, I agree entirely with Carlos, and I think that there is a supervening point which we need to make just in terms of how we view the immigration arena. Leaders of the future in countries with whom we are going to be doing business, with whom we're going to be having political, cultural and strategic links, we want those leaders to look kindly upon us. A very simple example is Bill Clinton, who was a Rhodes Scholar here back in the late 60s. He always had and maintained a very strong affection for his country, for this country. That would have been very difficult for him to do if he'd had absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. They have made the point that the current US president did not have quite so strong feelings about the country, and it potentially shows. Potentially, I'll say no more than that. What we do know is that the next generation of leaders in India and China have little or no interest in this country. They have merely seen us as a country which says, no, we don't want you, we want to make your life very difficult, we do not want to in any way assist you to come here. And on that point, by the way, I'll just make one final small point, and it's off message, but it's worth saying. Believe it or not, Germany attracts something like 8 times more Chinese tourists than this country does. And the reason is that Germany is seen as a more inviting country, and it is seen as a country who makes Chinese citizens' lives easier when applying for tourist visas to go there. You think now of the wealth that there is in China, and it's going to Munich, and it's going to Berlin, and it's going to Dusseldorf, and it is not going to Birmingham, Manchester or London.
And a final word from you. It seems like the headlines are been made by the immigration minister, and that's it, just it, headlines at the moment in terms of attracting the top Nobel Prize winning students from foreign countries.
Yeah, no, I think Damien Green is entirely the wrong person to be in charge of our immigration and to be standing there and giving out the negative messages he does. I think what we should be doing is giving out fantastic, positive, yes, we'd like you to come and visit, we'd love you to come and study, and we want you to embrace, because we are a tiny, tiny little pawn in the game of all of what's going on. And financially, we're suffering. And I think we need to wake up to the reality of where we're at in this country and think we need as much help as we can get. And if that means attracting foreign investors and foreign visitors, bring it on.
I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me, Juliet Spare in London at the Voice of Russia, Chris Magrath as Senior Partner and Head of Immigration and Employment Law at Magrath LLP, Carlos Vargas-Silva, Senior Researcher at the Centre on Migration, Policy and Society at the University of Oxford, and on the telephone, Anne Morris, Principal at DavidsonMorris Solicitors.